Okay, hello, Phil 103, both on campus and online. Today is going to be a video which goes over the questions for your second midterm. Just like the last midterm, it's exactly the same format. Please read over the comments that I put on your previous midterm. Look over the assessment key. That'll give you an idea of the kind of scope that I'm looking for these answers. And again, I'm not trying to trick you with these questions, but nonetheless, these questions relate to material that's rather difficult to understand. So the nature of the material requires sort of careful consideration. Like usual, there will be 6 questions, which you have. They're posted to Moodle. I've tried to give you lots of time for these questions, so please use that time and craft your responses carefully. Save yourself time for proofreading, and make sure I have your assignment by the indicated deadline. Um, it, it, so, right, this midterm is relating to Immanuel Kant, Grounding to the Metaphysics of Morals, and because the bookstore forgot to order one of our books, the general notion of utilitarianism, just really generally, and Mill's adaptation politically of utilitarian philosophy in On Liberty, sections 1 and 2. So that's going to be our exam. A couple of general notes. Again, please reference any material that does not come directly from me, either in the way of things I've said on campus in lecture or in the video lectures. If it's coming from Roderick or Sandel, let me know it's coming from Roderick or Sandel. If it's coming from Wiki or SparkNotes or Merriam-Webster.com or any of these online sources, anything that's not your own head, right? I need to know where it's come from, right? And you're supposed to delineate between your arguments and something you've picked up like externally. And I know on last midterm I issued a couple of warnings about that, but the course syllabus has a policy on plagiarism, and what you should do is look that over and ensure that your responses comply because warning time is over. I'm going to have to get serious with this. Now, also recall that these are longer answer questions and I require a minimum of 2 paragraphs of response for each. Now, what this new policy for these exams is actually presented me with is a bit of a challenge because, frankly, I wind up counting sentences. I define a paragraph as minimally 3 sentences. First off, a note about minimums. If you do the minimum, expect your grade to be minimal, right? So answer the question until it's answered. I stipulate a minimum just to prevent myself from having to give 2 paragraphs of comments on 3 sentences of response from students. This was happening. So if you don't give me 2 paragraphs, your response cannot receive a passing grade. The other thing that I wanted to mention about paragraphs is a paragraph is actually separate from the block of text that comes before it. Right? I know this may sound nitpicky to some of you, but nonetheless, what a paragraph is supposed to do is signal to your reader, and this helps with writing clearly and concisely about ideas. It's supposed to signal to your reader that okay, I've handled this one idea, now I'm moving on to the next concept or idea, right? The idea behind paragraph separations is to clarify for your reader what the heck is going on in the argument, right? So if I get one big block of text that is the appropriate number of sentences that technically might count as 2 paragraphs, it's still not separated into 2 paragraphs. So I need different paragraphs. So when you're starting a new subject, a new idea, a new concept, or something along those lines, separate it into a new paragraph. This is one of the things that we're trying to teach you in these introductory courses, which is how to write clearly about ideas. right? So I'm sure a number of you noticed on the last exam, I was making comments like this is unclear, right? And in some cases that had to do with grammar. So proofread, 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 read it out loud to make sure that it makes sense, or have somebody else read it over for you to make sure you're being clear and your arguments are making sense, right? So these answers are going to be graded out of 5 points each for a total of 30 points. One more general thing I want to mention to you is some of you are probably freaked out about your grade in the course after last exam. Refer, like I mentioned in the comments for your exam, but nonetheless refer to the course syllabus. There is a rubric for a percentage to letter grade conversion, and then the rubric for the letter grade conversion to your 4-point grade conversion. All of the materials you need to understand your grade are there. And this year I've even added a what your grade means, right? That gives you sort of a comment to understand if you get a particular letter grade, what that translates to in terms of plain language, what I'm saying about your ability to write and about the work that you've just given me, right? So um, please, please look at all of the material that I've given you for that. Okay, well, Immanuel Kant, we took a look at three formulations out of the 5 formulations of the categorical imperative that's offered by Kant. I've asked you questions on 2 of those formulations. The first thing I want to say about the Kant section is that question 1 and 3 look the same, but they relate to different formulations of the categorical imperative. So what Kant is saying with all of these formulations of the categorical imperative is there's so many ways of saying exactly the same thing. But nonetheless, they are subjectively relevant. They are beneficial, expedient ways of thinking through, right, how reason reveals duty to us, right? So it's going to be a different thought process to delineate between permissible and impermissible, and ultimately with these questions, perfect and imperfect duties. So, right, the question in the middle relates to your discussion forum question as well. So you've been working away at this and thinking it through. It's an interesting criticism of Kant's moral position that Kant wants to respond to. I'll give you an example for that one. So let's just go through the Kant questions one by one, then we'll turn to the Mill questions. I have to admit, in the first of the Mill questions, question number 4, I made a typo, and I've yet to correct it on Moodle, but nonetheless, I give you the reference to where on Liberty it comes from, so you can actually go and look up what it actually says. I'll make a note about that as well. So, question 1. In his discussion of the first formulation of the categorical imperative, and then I give it to you, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should be universal law. Kant draws a distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Now, for this question, I'm asking you to do 2 things, right? First, introduce this formulation of the categorical imperative. Don't just quote it. Tell me what it's asking you to do, right? What does it mean to act according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it be a universal law? Rick Roderick, in his treatment of Kant, actually does a fair job of introducing this. Act only according to that maxim. He says rule or principle that stands behind the action. And he goes as far as to mention to you as well that there is no I in that principle. It's an abstract or general rule that you are implying and formulating with the particular action that you're considering, right? So what Kant is doing with the first formula, actually all of the formulations of the categorical imperative, is putting our desires or inclination or the incentives that are to come from doing a particular action in brackets and putting them aside, right? And we are asking are questions about the moral validity of the principle that is to govern a particular action and asking if that principle can hold as a universal law, right? So he's given us the example in the first section of the grounding about telling a lie, right? Is it permissible for me to tell a lie? Right? And you can picture lots of situations where you might want to tell a lie, right? Like, oh, geez, I didn't get my homework done or this exam done, so I'm going to fabricate some sort of story so that I don't get in trouble and I still get my grades or my pay for having done the work, right? But what Kant wants you to do is actually abstract yourself from that situation and ask not what do I get out of this if I tell the lie, but rather, is it right? Right? So basically, in order to do that, what you have to do is abstract a general principle or a rule. When one, again, no I, when one is in a situation where one might benefit from doing so, it is permissible to tell a lie. Might be the principle or the abstract general rule, right? That holds, right? That stands behind the action. And then what you do is ask yourself, well, if that principle or maxim that stands behind my action were to become a universal law, would it make any sense whatsoever? Well, think about it. If it became a general rule that any time anyone was to stand benefit from telling a lie, it was permissible to lie, would anybody believe the lie in the first place? No. So then the lie wouldn't work. You see how that's sort of a rational contradiction right at the basis of the particular action that you're considering? So we know that telling a lie only works because it's an exception to the general rule, which tells everybody that they should tell the truth. Speech is built on it. So, right, the principle, the maxim, or the idea that stands behind the action of telling a lie cannot hold as a universal law. So you know right off the bat that it's impermissible to lie. So what I'm asking you to do is, examples are handy, but nonetheless, what I'm asking you to do, introduce the first formulation of the categorical imperative, is tell me what's going on, what Kant wants you to do when applying this first formulation. Second, and discuss how we should make the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Well, there's a mechanism at work here, and it's all right in the formulation that I've just given you. Act only according to that maxim. Okay, you abstract the maxim away from your particular incentives and desires and that sort of thing. All right? Act according to that maxim, whereby you could at the same time underline the word will, that it should be a universal law. So you're asking yourself two questions, right, really about your principle. Right? We've seen in the example I just gave you about telling a lie, right, that the maxim or principle that stands behind the action is a rational contradiction. Right? If it were to become a universal law, the universal law wouldn't make any sense and it would frustrate or refute the activity of lie telling in the first place. Right? So it's rationally contradictory. Well, the interesting thing about that is, and Kant's a little awkward with this, the inverse, to tell the truth, becomes a perfect duty. Rational contradiction, inverse, perfect duty. It's as simple as that. Right? Now, let's think of a different example. Right? Kant gives us 4 examples. I'll just go over 2. Right? Let's take a look at the 4th case that Kant gives us in the 2nd section. I've nicknamed this guy the miser, right? This is the person who, basically is a straight shooting businessman, right? He obeys all of his perfect duties. He tells the truth, he's honest, and he doesn't lie, doesn't cheat, he doesn't murder, he doesn't commit suicide, etc., etc., etc. Right? But he is a fairly successful person, and all around him he sees others who are in a state of suffering or in need, who he could help. But he's asking himself, does he really have a duty to help other people? Right? So Kant, I'll give you a page reference for this point on. Where is it? Second section. Bear with me a second here. Right. He gives you four examples, and they are on page 30 to 32. Right. And this is case number 4 from page 32. A fourth man finds things are going well for himself, but sees others whom he could help struggling with great hardships, and he thinks, what does it matter to me? And then what Kant does is basically, right, what he does is he formulates the maxim of the action here. Let everybody be as happy as heaven wills or as he can make himself. I shall take nothing from him, nor even envy him. But I have no desire to contribute anything to his well being or to his assistance when in need. Right? So ask yourself if that principle, right, not hurt nobody, but do I have a duty to help others? Let's say we don't have to help others. It becomes a universal law. Interestingly, there's no contradiction there. Right? That can hold as a universal law. But ask yourself the second question. Would anybody will that principle to be a universal law? And picture yourself in a situation. You fall down, you break your ankle, and you need some help. If it became a universal law that nobody helped one another, you'd be out of luck. Right? When something awful happens to you, you would, if that principle were to be a universal law, forego any sort of sympathy and comfort that you get from other people. Right? The point is, you're asking two questions. And the first, is it rational that this become a universal law? If the answer is no, then you've got a perfect duty to do the inverse. Right? If your principle holds rationally as a universal law, what Kant wants to point out is there is a further extent to his theory of morality. If the principle is rational, but nobody would want to live in such a world, right? Then what you find is that the principle conflicts the will. So, interestingly, in the terms of the example that we just used, right, you have an imperfect duty to help some people some of the time. The idea is that a perfect duty is a strong, absolute moral obligation. You must always tell the truth. You must never kill yourself, right? Relating to the examples Kant gives there, right? But there's a weaker form of moral obligation when it comes to examples like developing our talents. How much of them and how much of our time we should spend developing our talents? Well, it's a weaker sort of moral obligation. How much of our time should we be spending helping other people? You should help other people because nobody wants to live in a world where nobody helps anybody. Right? But it's a weaker sense of moral obligation. Right? But what I'm looking for in this question, right, discuss how we should make the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. In past semesters, what I have seen in responses from students that are just a little bit off the mark, right, is the idea that a perfect duty is a strong moral obligation, and imperfect duty is a weaker form of moral obligation. Yeah, that's right. But that's not what I'm asking here. I'm asking for a treatment of the mechanism by which we make the distinction. Okay, here I am in the world. I want to know whether I've got a perfect duty or an imperfect duty. How do I tell? Right? So that's the first question. There are two parts. Introduce the first formulation and tell me how I make the distinction between a perfect duty and an imperfect duty. Give me the nuts and bolts of that. Right? So that should be pretty clear. And generally, about this particular exam, Kant and Mill give you formulas. Right? So this should be pretty straightforward to you. Right? Now, question 2. At the start of section 2 of the grounding, so you know in the first couple of pages of section 2 of the grounding, what Kant does is he addresses a potential criticism of his position from a group he calls the self-love moralists. Right? Remember, for Kant, he gave us in section 1 those 4 cases. Actions that are counter to duty, right? Actions that are duty plus self-seeking inclination, actions that are duty plus immediate inclination. In both cases, you get something out of doing your duty, right? You've got a duty to pay your taxes, but also, what's more, what you've done is presented yourself with an accurate accounting of your earnings, and in fact, you've avoided certain legal penalties. Right? And with your tax money on top of that, you get good stuff like your roads paved and your sewers maintained, etc., etc. Right? So, in those cases, right, you get something out of it. Right? The third case, duty plus immediate inclination, you do the right thing, but hey, guess what? It's fun. I had a good time volunteering at that soup kitchen. Right? So in both cases, right, 2 and 3, Kant is saying that it's morally ambiguous why you're doing the action. You're doing your duty, yes, but are you doing it because it's your duty? We don't know. Right? The only clear-cut case of a morally good action, right? The only action Kant points out that we can be sure is doing the right thing and for the right reasons are those actions where you just really don't want to do your duty, but you do it because it's your duty. Right? So, what Kant wants to claim is that's the only non-ambiguous moral kind of action, because everything else, it's sort of an admixture of incentive or inclination, plus duty. And what Kant says is what makes a moral action moral is duty. Inclination doesn't factor into it. Right? So what these self-love moralists are claiming is that, oh, sorry, Kant, but there's no such thing. No such thing as an action done from duty alone. Any action in the whole history of humanity that has occurred or will occur has some sort of aspect of inclination bound right up with it. Right? So, in other words, Kant's moral philosophy is based on a fiction. This never happens. Right? So, your project, right, is to first present this criticism of Kant in your own words. How would you describe this criticism of Kantian morality? Right? You can use some of my words, that sort of thing, but nonetheless, put it in language of your own. But this criticism, right? Second part, how does Kant respond to this criticism? I'll point you to the passage. Right? And on top of that, what I'll do is I'll give you another example. Right? And feel free to use my examples as well. This is the second page of the second section of the grounding, page 20. Right? And Kant states, because of these things, nothing can protect us from a complete falling away from our ideas of duty and preserve in the soul a well-grounded respect for duty's law, except the clear conviction that, even if there never have been actions springing from such pure sources, the question at issue here is not whether this or that has happened, but that reason itself, independently of all experience, commands what ought to happen. Here, I'll put that in my own words. Even if this never happens, even if the pure unambiguous case of duty just never happens, Kant's claiming this is still what makes a moral action a moral action. right? Even in case 2 and 3, where there's some sort of incentive present. It's not the incentive that makes it a moral action, it's duty. So, even in those cases, right, what Kant is saying here, right, is that reason, independently of all experience, commands what ought to happen. Right? Now he gives us an example. This is a weird text. He's actually giving us examples. Consequently, reason unrelentingly commands actions of which the world has perhaps hitherto never provided an example, and whose feasibility might well be doubted by one who bases everything on experience. For instance, even though there might never have yet been a sincere friend, still pure sincerity in friendship is nonetheless required of every man, because this duty, prior to all experience, is contained as duty in the general idea of a reason that determines the will by means of a priori grounds. So what the heck's he talking about here? Pure sincerity in friendship is something that's contained and implied by the act of friendship itself. So if you're not a sincere friend, and nobody has ever had a sincere friend, still, friendship involves that kind of sincerity, and we still should be sincere friends. Another example, let's say, just thought experiment, give me this as an assumption. Let's say in the whole history of marriage, no couple has been ever completely faithful. Right? This kind of fidelity in marriage, in the whole history of humanity, has never actually occurred. This is a thought experiment. I'm not saying this is actually the case, but like in the thought experiment, put that in brackets and grant me the proposition. If that were the case, should you be faithful to your spouse? Kant would argue yes. Why? Because contained right in the vow and in the act of the commitment necessary to have a marriage, there's the idea, the principle of fidelity. Even if everybody breaks the rule all the time, the rule's still the rule, and what should you do? Kant points out, you should always do what you should do, even if you don't want to do it. Right? You see, what Kant is claiming is that, let's continue with the marriage example here for a second, right? What Kant is claiming is that, quite frankly, we're in a situation where if we get married and make a vow, you're all eventually going to have a situation where maybe you're a little tempted to cheat, right? Maybe, right? You have this inclination to do so. What Kant is claiming about morality is that really morality only really works because we're the kind of creatures who can act otherwise than our inclinations or in terms of these incentives. Right? When we say, I will be faithful to you, that's a promise, and a promise has its value. Not the fact that you'll always want to be faithful or always want to act in terms of the promise, but even if you don't want to act in terms of the promise, the value of the promise is that you will. In other words, reason acts on the will irrespective of inclination, and we do what's right, whether we want to or not. Right? One more example. Most of you drive on I-75. Anyone do the speed limit? No, of course not. Should you do the speed limit? Of course, it's the rule. So, what Kant is claiming, right, is even if these things never happen, even if most of human actions have some sort of aspect of inclination kicking around behind them, still, what you should do is what you should do, whether or not you want to. That's morality. That's just what it is. And question 2 is a nice bridge question to question 3. Question 3, in his discussion of the second formulation of the categorical imperative, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of another, always as an end in itself and never merely as a means. Kant draws a distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Different formulation. Introduce this formulation of the categorical imperative and discuss how we should make the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Now, what Kant's claiming here is that the second formulation is just another way of saying what was said in the first formulation, right? And what's more, what he's presented us with is an argument for how the second formulation is contained already in the first. If you look at what we're doing in the first formulation, we're bracketing inclination, putting it over there, examining the principle and our intentions behind the action, and the only moral intentions, according to Kant, are when reason acts on the will, and we act in terms of duty. We're doing something interesting with this first formulation of the categorical imperative. We are essentially legislating universal law. Reason is acting on the will, and founding principles that should hold for every rational being. Right? So we become legislators of morality. Right? We're acting autonomously. My cat can't act autonomously. My cat just wants what it wants. Right? But human beings are interesting and worthy of dignity and respect because reason can act on the will irrespective of inclination. And even if we don't want to do what we should do, we can still control ourselves well enough to do what we should do. That is, humans act morally. Cats just act on desire. Right? So, that's the interesting thing about humans. What this formulation of the categorical imperative requires of us is that when we encounter moral agents, like another human being, any other human being, we acknowledge that these people are worthy of that dignity and respect, ourselves included. Right? So we should never use ourselves or other people as merely means to our ends. That merely is important. But always treat them with dignity and respect. Now let's go back to the examples to make the delineation between perfect and imperfect duties. What are you doing when you tell a lie to get what you want? What you're doing is you're fooling another human being. What you're doing is you are using them as a means to your end. You're failing to give them the kind of dignity and respect that they deserve as beings who are moral and rational, and beings between yourself and them, there is no morally relevant distinction. Right? So, when you tell a lie, it's a direct affront to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. It directly contradicts the humanity principle. That's what this formulation is called. Right? How about the second case? Right? Helping other people. Do I have a duty to help other people? Well, if nobody helped anybody, it's not like I'm using people as a means to my end. Right? If I lived my entire life and never helped another person, ever, right? It's not like I'm using these people I'm not helping as a means to my end. I'm not kicking them, I'm not enslaving them, I'm not abusing them, I'm not lying to them. I am acting perfectly with regard to what Kant calls my perfect duties. But really, am I crafting actions, and are my intentions such that they harmonize with the deeper importance of this formulation of the categorical imperative? Kant argues, no. You have to care and offer sympathy and help when needed to other human beings if you really want to treat them in their fullest sense as though the other humans or the other rational beings just like you are ends in themselves and not merely just means to be used for your own purposes. So that's Kant. Right? Not bad, eh? Right? So you've got two formulations, the categorical imperative and the criticism and a response. Right? Again, what I would do if I were laying out my responses to this, I did this in my comprehensive exams. Basically, I broke down the question to its various parts, wrote it out on a piece of paper next to my exam while I was spreading it, and ticked them off one at a time while I was doing it. In the last exam, most people who lost grades either for clarity or completeness. This is why proofreading is important, but right, in addition to that, you got to mention that you are sufficient, or you got to make sure that you're sufficiently answering all parts of the question. So, right, if you just in the first question or the third question discuss how to make the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties without introducing the formulation of the categorical imperative indicated, you only get half marks for that question. Again, if you only present the criticism in question two without actually treating Kant's response, or giving me one little sentence about Kant's response, that's not sufficient, right? You only did part of the question, not the whole thing. So I want you to answer the whole thing, and I've given you enough time that you should be able to do so. Okay? If I were writing this exam, I'd chip away at these questions a little bit at a time. Right? I'd think them through, I'd save myself time to proofread my answers, etc., etc., etc. All right, on to Bill. And this is the question with my typo. I'll point it out as I'm reading the question. I give you a good deal of preamble here, and interestingly, it's sort of a long question where I set it up. Bill subscribes to utilitarian morality, which holds that the right thing to do is that action which promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. So utilitarianism is that theory that holds that we should produce as much benefit as possible. Right? Mill actually claims that avoiding pain amounts to the same thing as promoting pleasure, right? For the purposes of his calculations. Right? In On Liberty, Mill finds it necessary to impose a practical limit on utilitarian moral considerations. He states, there is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with the individual independence. And, that's my typo, I typed and, right? And to find that limit and maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism. That's Mill on Liberty, page 5. All right, so if you're looking for that, that's where you go find it. So your question, why does Mill find it necessary to impose a limit on the general notion of utility? Now, in the video resources that I've given you, do you remember in the Sandel video, probably about a third or two-thirds of the way in, he started addressing student concerns, and that one student raised the question, wait, what about minorities? Right? Because essentially in utilitarianism, everybody's pleasure and everybody's pain counts as one vote. Right? So Sandel used the example of what about the Christians in the Roman Colosseum that were horribly killed and maimed and fed to lions and that sort of thing. Right? So their pain or their pleasure counts as one vote. Right? And actually does count. But what about the collective ecstasy of the entire crowd actually watching this contest, this agon go on? Their collective pleasure might just outweigh the pain and suffering and horrible death at the hands of lions or other gladiators or what have you of the person in the Colosseum. Here's another example. I know my on-campus class has got this example. Let's say I'm a medical doctor, and let's say that I'm a staunch utilitarian, right? An unrestrained utilitarian, not Mill's kind of utilitarian, but a staunch one. And As a medical doctor, I have 5 people, all of whom are going to die probably tomorrow or the next day if they don't get organ transplants. And let's say you come in with a boo-boo on your finger that needs treatment with nice pink healthy organs that are compatible for these 5 people. Do the math. Do the utilitarian calculation. The greatest good for the greatest number. It makes perfect sense for a good, staunch utilitarian doctor to sedate you and harvest your organs, planting them in each of the 5 people, saving 5 lives for the low, low cost of 1, your life. Think about that. Right? So, why does Mill find it necessary to impose this limit on the general notion of utility? To handle the criticism of the utilitarian doctrine. Right? What's the limit? In general terms, the notion of liberty. In specific terms, right, he tells us that the practical limit is his principle of harm. Right? So, why does he find it necessary to impose this limit? Set up in your own words the problematic. Right? And in order to protect the individual in terms of liberty from the will of the collective is your response. And then I ask you to do something critical here. That's part 1 of the question. Why does Mill find it necessary to impose this limit? Second, does this limitation run counter, by your account, to the general notion of utility? Oh, that's Kant. Here is Mill. Mill, section 1. Page 12. No society in which these liberties are not, on the whole, respected is free, whatever may be its form of government, and none is completely free in which they do not exist absolute and unqualified. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing your own good in your own way, so long as you do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental and spiritual. Mankind are greater gainers. Greater gainers, that might be a utilitarian word. By suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves, than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. So what Mill is doing, and I've tried to make this fairly clear to you, is he is making a utilitarian argument for a practical limit on the unrestrained notion of utility. But your question is, does he succeed, or does this run counter to the general notion of utility? Okay? So craft your argument. I'm asking you to take a critical stance here. And frankly, this is an ethics class. These guys are trying to tell you what to do. You should take a critical stance. Question 2. Or question 5, actually, 2 for Mill. Mill discusses in On Liberty the principle of harm. Oh, that's the limit. What would constitute harm for Mill? All right. And this is in addition to the obvious forms of harm of punching, kicking, throwing down elevator shafts, pulling hair, pulling teeth, that sort of thing, etc., etc. What constitutes harm, right, for Mill? Right? And he's rather explicit on page 11 over to 12 about the essential human liberties. So there's your hint. Right? What would constitute harm? How does the position presented by Mill on liberty relate to the general position of utilitarianism. Present arguments to support your position. Right? So that's what I'm asking you to do in each of these questions, right, is evaluate Mill's argument in terms of what you know generally about utilitarianism. And I've given you lots of video resources for that, right? I've gone over it with you, right? So you know the nuts and bolts. I mean, interestingly, the utilitarian position is just so obvious, right? So intuitive, right? We don't need a lot of background to be thrashed out here. Right? And question 6. In your own words, provide a summary of the main lines of argument presented by Mill that justify the liberty of thought discussion found in the second section of On Liberty. Remember, there were two basic lines of argument. One pertaining to whether or not we know, whether or not we think the position we're considering suppressing is just wrong, right? Or let's even say that the position that we are arguing from is not only true, but the whole truth. Mill presents arguments for how it's beneficial, right, to suffer challenges to this position. Right? So I've given you a good outline for basically 4 lines of argument. There are 2 main lines of argument with subsections each. Right? There are two-part lines of argument. Right? So basically, what I'm asking you to do is summarize the second section of On Liberty. Mill goes on ad nauseum with examples. Just give me the gist of it. Right? Is the idea. So pay attention to the due date. I've made this exam due at 5 minutes to midnight. Oh, geez. Get it done early. You don't want to be up to 5 minutes to midnight, right? And inevitably what will happen if you are up to 5 minutes to midnight is that, in fact, your exam will try to come in at 3 minutes to midnight, and I'll get an email saying, oh, Professor Yoakum, it closed down on me. I didn't get a chance to submit on time. Submit it early to make sure you've got everything done. Submit your responses via Moodle in .doc, docx, or .txt format, right? I'm pretty good with converters, right? But one thing I want to point out to you is that it seems like every time an open freely document is submitted to Moodle, I only get the first page of the document, right? And if I don't have it, it's not complete and that sort of thing. It's your responsibility to make sure I have your assignment. I can't be chasing, after 140 of you students, right? I have to get on grading these as soon as possible. Right. So one of the things that happened the last time is that there were light assignments. There were completely understandable reasons for extensions, but the problem with Moodle is if I grade an assignment, it gives you feedback instantly, and if I give you feedback instantly, then what I've done is I've potentially given the other people who have not submitted the assignment yet the answers to the assignment, which isn't fair to those of you that thought through it and worked through it, right? So I'm held up by having to give extensions. So it behooves us to be as lickety-split and quick with actually getting these assignments in as possible. That way I can start grading them as soon as possible and you get your grades back. I'm also hitting a much lighter time of the semester, right? So I should be able to turn these around a whole lot quicker so that you'll have your feedback a lot quicker. I know I am traditionally a little bit slow on grading. That's partially because I'm working a lot and trying to maintain a bit of a life, right? You would too. But nonetheless, the last exam was a little bit longer than I even like, right? So I got behind on grading. For that, I apologize, and I'm going to try and turn these around as quickly as possible. Of course, there's a tension. I'm trying to give you as much feedback as I can in a very short amount of time. And initially, when I first started grading these things, they take about 25 minutes each. Multiply that by 140 of these things, and you see the problem. Right. So understand that I'm making every effort to get these to you as quickly as possible. The other thing to keep in mind for both my on-campus and online classes is I have regular office hours on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If you have any questions about the material, any questions about the content, any questions about the questions, these are drop-in office hours. I'm in room 319 of O'Dowd from 1:15 to 2:15, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Please, please, please come and see me if you're not clear on how you're being assessed or what's going on with this course. Every semester, I seem to get one or two complaints with people that don't feel I've given them enough feedback. Like I say, there's a tension between turnaround time and the amount of feedback that I can give, but I'm always there and I'm always willing to discuss this material and discuss how you're being assessed with you in person, right? So there is an extent to which I'm expecting, if you're confused or uncertain with how you're being assessed, I expect you to actually, exhibit some agency and come see me about it, right? I do put 3 hours a week, right, which may not sound like a long time, but nonetheless, I do specifically put that time aside to address your questions and concerns. And on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, I actually have a bit of a break too. So if my office hours don't work for you, I can frequently schedule some sort of an appointment, right? And for those of you that are online and can't make it to campus, I offered in the welcome lecture, I'll mention again too, that I can meet with you via Skype if you make an appointment with me and keep that appointment, right? Because frequently I put the block of time aside, right? And don't schedule other things. I tell other students I can't meet with you because I have a meeting with this other student, right? So if I get stood up for these meetings, right, it means that other students don't get what they need as a result. And so let's be good utilitarians about all of this and try to promote the greatest good for each of you and for the greatest number to the maximum extent possible. So let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to reading your responses, and we will see you on the flip side.